Hey, year 10s, let's take up assessment 6, which is factorizing quadratics and solving quadratics. Now we're only going to take up 3 questions on this, but every single question is pretty much the same mistake. Almost in every case, it's a plus or minus mistake somehow. Let's get started. Okay, so I've given you this word bank down here so that you could pick and choose your answer so we wouldn't have problems with people putting in extra spaces or extra mistakes like that. I don't know if that made that more complicated for you, but you should always be showing your own working anyways, not just looking for your answer down here. So these are all split the middle term type questions. At least I think so. They all have a number in front of the x squared term. So I will just go through and check and make sure that I can't factor that out of any of these. I can't factor out the 2 here, can't factor out the 2 there, can't factor out the 4, can't factor out the 4, just because that one last term, and I can't factor out the 8. Okay, I've confirmed. They are all split the middle term cases. Okay, so looking at this first one here, I'm going to do 2 times the minus 1, that's negative 2. And I need to find two numbers that multiply to make negative 2, but add to make negative 1. And I found those numbers to be negative 2 and 1. Negative 2 times 1 makes negative 2, and negative 2 plus 1 will still be negative 1. So I've split my middle term. That minus x has become minus 2x plus 1x. Now I'm factorizing by parts, and I organized it this way because I thought it would be easier for me. Seeing that these first two terms both have 2x in them, I can factor out the 2x. And these last two terms don't seem to have a common factor at all, but remember that I'd always put a 1 in front of the brackets. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I factored the 2x out of the first two terms, so that divided by 2x is just x. That divided by 2x is just minus 1. And then looking at the last two terms, I couldn't find a common factor, so I just put a 1 out front, and I made sure that those brackets would match, and they do. I've got x minus 1 in one bracket, x minus 1 in the other bracket. So I can go ahead and regroup that then. One of my brackets is going to just be x minus 1, and the other bracket is going to be the 2x plus the 1. Okay, next one. Again, we're splitting the middle term. I'll do a times c. 2 times 1 is 2, and I need to find two numbers that multiply to make positive 2, but add to make a negative. If I see a negative anywhere in this quadratic, I'm going to think about two numbers that are definitely not both positive. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to make a positive though, and add to make a negative. They must have the same sign, so they must both be negative because there's no way two positive numbers will add to make a negative. So I'm looking for two negative numbers. Multiply to make 2, add to make negative 3, and that's negative 2 and negative 1. So I've split my negative 3x into negative 2x and negative 1x. Again, I've bordered it this way because I can see that the first two terms have common factor. That common factor, again, is 2x. So I'm going to factor 2x out of those two. And then I'm looking at the last two terms, and they don't seem to have anything in common. So again, I'll always think to pull a 1 out. But should I pull out positive 1 or negative 1? That depends on the brackets. I need those brackets to match. See, when I pulled the 2x out of the first two terms, I've got x minus 1 in the first set of brackets because that would have been x, and that would have been minus 1 when you divide them by 2x. So the second set of brackets also has to be x minus 1. It can't be negative x plus 1. That's what helped me decide that I have to pull out or factor out that negative 1. Now I've got negative 1 times x would be the negative 1x, and negative 1 times negative 1 would be that plus 1. So that's what decides the sign for me. The brackets must match. Now that the brackets match, I know that one of my brackets is x minus 1, and the other bracket's going to be 2x minus 1. Okay, next question. Again, I'm splitting the middle term, so looking at first term is 4, times last term is 1, 4 times 1 is 4. I need two numbers that multiply to make 4 and add to make 5. There are no negatives in this question. It's not like I'm multiplying to make a negative, so I need one positive, one negative. I'm not adding to make a negative, so I don't need at least a negative. Both of these numbers could be positive. Both of these numbers should be positive. I'm looking at positive 4 and positive 1. Again, I chose the order so that the first two terms I can clearly see what their common factor is. They can both be divided by 4x. So I'll factor the 4x out of these two terms, and again, my last two terms don't seem to have a common factor. So is it 1 or is it minus 1? I don't see any negatives in any of this, so I'm thinking it's 1, but remember, just make sure those brackets will match. When I factored the 4x out of the first two terms, I ended up with x and 1. So I've got x plus 1 in the second bracket, in the first bracket. And the second bracket should match. Here I do have x plus 1, so I can just factor positive 1 out of there, and then I have a matching x plus 1 in the second bracket. Okay, let's regroup. I know one of my brackets is going to be x plus 1, and the other bracket's going to be the 4x plus 1. Next, again, I've got a 4x squared out front and a 1 at the back, so I'm going to do the 4 times the 1, multiplies to make 4, and adds to make negative 4. Now I see there's a negative in this quadratic, so I have to really think about my signs. There's at least going to be one negative in here. Is there going to be two? Well, if it multiplies to make a positive, the signs have to be the same. So they must both be negatives. So I'm looking for a number that multiplies to make positive 4 and adds to make negative 4. And it's a negative and a negative. Negative 2 and negative 2 multiply to make positive 4 and add to make negative 4. So I split my negative 4x into negative 2, negative 2x. Right, looking at my first two terms, I do see a common factor here. They can both be divided by 2 and x. And my last two terms don't seem to have a common factor, but I do have these negatives. I want to make sure that I'm going to do this right. Should I pull a positive one out or a negative one out? Let's see. If I pull 2x out of the first two terms, I'm going to have 2x minus 1 in the first bracket, excuse me. So I'm going to need to pull a negative 1 out of the second bracket because I don't want negative 2x plus 1, I want positive 2x minus 1. So when I factor out a negative 1, that's going to change the sign of both of these terms. I've got the same second bracket, 2x minus 1, 2x minus 1. That's going to be one of my brackets over here. The other bracket, hey, look at that coincidence, is also 2x minus 1. Okay, last one. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to be 8 times negative 1, that's negative 8, and add to make negative 2. Lots of negatives in this question. The kinds of numbers that multiply to make a negative, though, is one positive and one negative. And if they add to make a negative, the bigger number should be negative. So numbers that multiply to make negative 8, negative 8 and 1, negative 4 and 2, that's the one, negative 4 and 2. Right? Those multiply to make negative 8 and they add to make negative 2. Looking at the first two terms again, I've ordered them this way because I can see they've got a common factor of 4x. So I'll factor out the 4x here. And once again, I'm stuck with these last two terms that don't seem to have a common factor. So shall I factor out 1 or should I factor out negative 1? Let's see what the bracket looks like for the first. The first terms, when I factored out the 4x, that left me with 2x, because 4x times 2x makes the 8x squared, minus 1, because 4x times minus 1 will give me the minus 4x. So my 2x minus 1, that's the bracket to match. And these last two terms are 2x minus 1, so I can just factor out positive 1 for there, and then I have a matching bracket. So I know one of my brackets is 2x minus 1, and my other brackets will be 4x plus 1. Okay, factorizing to solve. The last exercise we just did was just factorizing and splitting the middle term. Here we've got a quadratic equal to 0, which is good. We can't solve a quadratic if it's not equal to 0. So we need to factorize this, set it up as two sets of brackets, multiplied together, and then either one bracket is 0 or the other bracket is 0. So let's start by factorizing this. Now it's a difficult one to factorize because it's got a number in front of the x squared term, and I can't factor that out of all terms. I'm going to go ahead and split the middle term. So I think first term times last term, a times c is negative 18. Two numbers that multiply to make negative 18, but add to make positive 7. They must be a positive number and a negative number if they're going to multiply to make a negative. And the bigger number must be the positive one because they add to make a positive. I'm thinking 9 and minus 2. So I split the 7x in the middle to 9x minus 2x. That makes 7x, right? And I put them in this order because I can clearly see that the 6x squared and the 9x have a common factor. The 2x had that common factor as well, but I put it this way because I thought they had a better common factor. Common factor here is 3x. And common factor for the last two? Oh, I don't see much of a common factor. I see that they're both negative though. That might indicate that I need to pull out a negative 1. Let's see. When I factored the 3x out of the first two terms, that gives me 2x plus 3 in the brackets. And yes, here I see this is minus 2x minus 3. I definitely want that to be 2x plus 3, so I'll factor out the negative 1. So I've got a matching bracket here. I know that that's going to be one of the brackets of my answer. The other bracket's going to be the 3x minus the 1, but that's not the answers we're looking for. We're looking for the values of x, so we're not done yet. Our two answers from x come from these two brackets, though. Either this bracket's equal to 0 or this bracket's equal to 0. So let's start with this one. If 3x minus 1 equals 0, let's rearrange to find out what x is. 3x would be equal to 0 plus 1, just pulling that one across. So x would be equal to a third. In this case, to make this equal to 0, let's get the x on its own. 2x is equal to 0 minus the 3, and x is equal to negative 3 over 2. Okay, answering to 3 significant figures is if necessary, that tells me that I should probably write these as decimal values rather than fractions. So the first one's going to be 0.3 recurring. To 3 significant figures, that is 3 non-zero digits. That's 333 after the decimal. And this one, to 3 significant figures, well, this doesn't even give me 3 significant figures, so that's why it says if necessary. This gives me negative 1.5. Last question, factorizing to simplify fractions. This is a really good example of why we are factorizing, learning and practicing how to do this now, so don't forget this skill. We want to simplify this fraction, which means we're going to divide both the top and the bottom by their highest common factor. So let's figure out what we can divide them both by. Don't anybody ever look at this and say, cross out the x squares, done. That's subtracting, not dividing. We need to find a common factor to divide both top and bottom by. So factorizing the top, it's a nice easy quadratic. There's no number in front of the x squared, so I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to make negative 6 and add to make negative 1. One's positive, one's negative, if they're going to multiply to make a negative, and the bigger is negative because they add to make a negative. Negative 3 and positive 2. Yeah. And on the bottom here, it's a two-term quadratic. We're missing the middle term. There's no x term here. Two-term quadratics, I always think, what's that acronym? Something about two something. Difference of two squares. It is a subtraction. That makes it a difference of two terms. And those terms are squared terms. This is x squared, and 9 is the same thing as 3 squared. So that's a squared term. Okay, so we're going to have a set of brackets. Both of them have the same letter and number in them. They just have opposite signs. So x plus 3, x minus 3. Now that's just me factorizing the numerator and denominator. A lot of you did that and then didn't actually simplify. Looking at this in the factorized form, I see that there is a common factor on both the top and bottom. I can divide the top by x minus 3, and that would just leave me with the x plus 2, and divide the bottom by the x minus 3, and that would just leave me with the x plus 3. So that's my simplified fraction then, x plus 2 over x plus 3. Okay,